Yes.
Warm greetings to all. This is Mrs. P. Lalita, Assistant Professor of English from Vellalar College for Women. On behalf of our department, I cordially welcome you all for this, a 4-day virtual international conference on diaspora across time and space, multifarious understandings of Indian diaspora literature. Now, we are fortunate to have a cheerful person, Professor Clara Chambers, a senior lecturer, University of York, for this 3rd-day session of International Conference. It's my pleasure to welcome our guest, who's going to share her perspectives on topic, The World and the Home, a gender reading of diasporic literature from New India. Now, I'm delighted and feel proud to introduce Professor Clara Chambers, a senior lecturer in global literature at the University of York, where she teaches 20th and 21st century writing in English from South Asia, the Arab world, and their diasporas. Clara, who is the author of books namely British Muslim Fictions, Interviews with Contemporary Writers, Britain Through Muslim Eyes, Literary Representatives, 1780 to 1988, Rivers of Ink, Selected Essays, and Making Sense of Contemporary British Muslim Novels, and co-editor of Imagining Muslims in South Asia and the Diaspora, Secularism, Religion, Representations. She has published post-colonial text and contemporary women's writing. Besides, she is an editor with Rachel Gilmore of the Journal of Commonwealth Literature and co-editor of 2 book series, namely Multicultural Textualities and Global Literature, 21st Century Perspectively. Further than, she is also a co-investigator on AHRC funded project titled Storying Relationships, which is run by Professor Richard Phillips from University of Sheffield. Yes. Now we are all eager to listen to such a person with a profound knowledge and experience in her area. I request and hand over the session to Professor Clara to commence. Please, ma'am.
Thank you.
Can you see your screen clear now?
I can, but there is a black square in the middle. I'm not sure why.
That is now removed.
Oh, great. Thank you.
I just have a word for co-host. Please keep admitting people from your end. Hello.
Hello. Shall I go?
Yeah. No, I'm talking to Vellalar College. Okay, they will keep admitting people. You start.
Okay, thank you so much. Am I audible, first of all? Can everybody hear?
Yes, you are audible.
Great, thank you. So, thank you very much for the warm welcome. Could you stop sharing screen just for 5 minutes so I can just thank the organisers?
Sure.
Perfect. So, I want to thank all the organisers, to Ma'am for that very warm and generous introduction, to Vellalar College for Women, and especially to Professor Jay Singh of FLU, who invited me to give this talk. Just a little piece of information that might interest people. I actually studied at FLU a long time ago in, I think, around the year 2000, when it was still CFL. I was there for 4 months and made a lot of friends, living in Osmania University. So I have very happy memories of the south of India. And hopefully when this pandemic is over, I would love to come back to India and meet people in person. So I'm really happy to be here and giving this talk. So before I get started, just to double check that everyone can hear me okay. Is the pace of what I'm saying comprehensible?
Yeah, it's comprehensible.
Okay, great, thank you. So if I could have the very first slide, please, of my PowerPoint, that would be great.
Yeah.
Perfect. So if you could, please, could you click slideshow at the top?
Yeah. I do.
Yeah. In the middle, slideshow.
Yeah.
Yes, perfect. And the next slide, please. Thank you so much. I'm sorry about the technical difficulty.
No problem.
But this is the structure of my talk today. In this paper, I want to explore how the 19th and early 20th century discourse of a gendered home and world, private and public distinctions maps onto contemporary diasporic literature from India. As I'm sure you all know, Rabindranath Tagore articulated this well in his 1916 novel, The Home and the World. More recently, in The Nation and Its Fragments, Partha Chatterjee theorizes what he calls the home and world dichotomy as a way for nationalists to emulate their British colonizers' material successes, but to strive for preservation of Indian spirituality and values in private. As such, Chatterjee argues, woman, nation, and home were rendered synonymous in the national context, in that context of the nationalist movement. And these private entities were pitted against the world, which was deemed the colonial power. In other words, Chatterjee argues that middle-class Indians believed culture was divided into two spheres, the material and the spiritual, or, following Tagore, the home and the world. It was only in the material, worldly sphere that members of the Bhadralok, such as Ram Mohan Roy, were keen to learn from the West. In the spiritual sphere, most Indians viewed their own mythologized traditions, particularly around what was then called the woman question, as superior to and unaffected by those of the British colonizers. Staying with the notion of spirituality, but looking further back to ancient India, there is also the idea of Akam, inside, and Puram, outside. Vikram Chandra explains that the Sangam poets from southern India, 300 BC to 300 AD, divided the world into Akam, which is similar to A.K. Ramanujan's interior landscape, which was suffused with the pleasures and pains of love, sex, and attachment, and on the other side, Puram, the external panorama of politics, heroic striving, social attachment, and obligation, end quote. This interior-exterior dichotomy is, of course, a gendered division, and it persists even to this day. Mukesh Singh, one of the 6 rapists convicted in the 2012 Delhi rape case, did some reprehensible victim blaming in the BBC's India's Daughter documentary. And he links this to the home and the world dichotomy, saying, "A decent girl won't roam around at 9 o'clock at night," end quote. Mukesh Singh's assumption is that a good girl wouldn't go out after dark, so any woman leaving the home at this time had it coming. Clearly, the rules for men are totally different, as he too was outside the home after dark, so there's a gender double standard there. It is important to make clear that this home-world split is also about the public and the private, and about Purda, a practice about which Indian poet Eunice D'Souza edited an important anthology, including such early to mid-20th century women writers as Nawab Sultan Jahan Begum, Ismet Chugtai, and Rashid Jahan. But how does all this relate to 21st century diasporic literature? I want to argue that cultural narratives further. I believe that female-associated topics such as fashion, food, and families are not getting the serious attention and recognition that they deserve in the global literary marketplace. First, it is crucial to contextualize my discussion of the novel against the backdrop of Homi Bhabha's seminal essay, The Home and the World. This essay is famous for being the first place where Bhabha outlined his idea, which was developed further in Nation and Narration, that nationalist discourses tend to depict the nation in terms of, quote, the Heimlich pleasures of the hearth, end quote. While the people on the other side of the border are portrayed with unheimlich terror. Unheimlich is from the German meaning unhomely. Unheimlich terror of the space or race of the other, end quote. Amidst all Bhabha's suggestive use of Freudian psychoanalytic theory, less often recognised is his discussion of world literature. The study of world literature, he importantly conjectures, might be the study of the way in which cultures recognise themselves through their projection of otherness. Jay, if you could just move the slide to the next one, please, that would be great.
Yes.
Thank you. Perfect. Yeah. So I'm talking about Homi Bhabha's The Home and the World. And in an intervention that sounds remarkably prescient today, he argues that world literature's natural territory is the transnational realm of, quote, migrants, the colonised, or the political refugee, end quote. In the essay, Bhabha also writes about what he calls the house of fiction as follows. Jay, please could you move to the next slide?
Yeah.
Lovely. So this is a quote. In a feverish stillness, the intimate recesses of the domestic space become sites of history's most intricate invasions. In that displacement, the border between home and world becomes confused, and uncannily, the private and the public become part of each other, forcing upon us a vision that is as divided as it is disorienting. If you could move back to the previous, that would be great. Thank you so much. Brilliant. This passage immediately sets the tone with that oxymoron, feverish stillness, going on to explore how home and world, which seem like two separate or indeed opposed entities, in fact blur into each other and overlap. And I think we're seeing that in the present moment. The borders that we think exist between home and the world are completely blurry. Look at us all. We're sitting in our homes in an international conference. The world has come to us. So I think this is a very good moment to think about these issues. Women have been associated with the home, men with the world, but now most people are at home. Things are all jumbled up, and I think we need to really think about it as we move forward in the 21st century. Reinforcing this point about the blurring of world and home, Bhabha goes on to write of the unheimlich or unhomely as the shock of recognition of the world in the home in the world. As significant as Bhabha's delineation of the interpenetration of the private and the public was, it behoves us to critique his gender politics in this essay. Although Bhabha writes, I have focused this argument on the woman framed, Nadine Gordimer's Ayla, and the woman renamed, Toni Morrison's beloved, end quote, their womanhood is barely discussed, aside from one nodding reference to the French feminist notion of jouissance. In literary texts, Indian writers frequently stage the family home as a microcosm of the nation. R.K. Narayan's The Financial Expert, 1952, for example, contains a description of a discordant extended family that may have provided inspiration for the quarrelsome Boses in Amitav Ghosh's 1988 novel, The Shadow Lines, whose house is divided when the grandmother's family and that of her uncle Jethamashai quarrel over trivialities. As both men sprang from notoriously litigious stock, their disagreement takes the form of sending each other legal notifications, culminating in the decision to divide the house with a partition wall. The use of the term partition wall, of course, echoes the partition of India. In Narayan's The Financial Expert, similarly, two brothers fall out and get involved in litigation, which culminates in them partitioning, quote, everything that could be cut in two with an axe or scissors or a knife, end quote. In his celebrated poem, Small Scale Reflections on a Great House, A.K. Ramanujan uses the image of the house to more resonant effect in evoking the Indian nation. Like Amitav Ghosh's family home in Dhaka from The Shadow Lines, the great house of Ramanujan's title is depicted as being sprawling and all-enveloping. From the first line of his poem, sometimes I think that nothing that ever comes into this house goes out, end quote. The house is established as a decaying place where one could get trapped amid the clutter. An inference is thus made that the house's structure resembles the assimilatory and accommodating energies of the Indian nation. A more pointed reference to India's history, specifically an allusion to the colonial destruction of India's garment industry, is made in the description of the family's possessions, which leave the house only to return, quote, like the hooped bales of cotton shipped off to invisible Manchesters and brought back milled and folded, end quote. Through small-scale, homely descriptions of the everyday routines of an Indian household, therefore, Ramanujan calls to mind diverse aspects of the Indian nation. Now, the concept of home has rightly been attracting attention from critics, including Sushila Nasta, Avtar Brar, Sarah Brophy, and Lucinda Nunes for many years. However, just as I have theorised the home novel, the world novel should also be situated with reference to theory, such as Edward Said's discussion of worldliness. In Said's The World, the Text and the Critic, the Palestinian theorist argues against post-structuralists such as Paul Ricoeur, who view the text as existing outside the world in a rarefied arena of relationships with other texts. Instead, Said argues, texts belong to the world, their worldliness being signalled through the fact that these texts are subject to and producers of circumstances. The world novel also needs by David Danmosh, Franco Moretti, Pascal Casanova, Emily Apter, and others. These world literature theorists bring in the important issue of translation, but too often they allow world novels from other languages to appear in attractive consumerist menu of texts. There for the taking, the complexity of their worldliness and post-colonial condition, unlike in Said, these politics are not foregrounded enough. Let us zero in on one of these world literature theorists in particular, Franco Moretti. In his essay, Conjectures on World Literature, Moretti suggests that there needs to be a worldly change in methodology when it comes to how we study literature. We only read texts that we feel are important or canonical. He says, you invest so much in individual texts only if you think very few of them really matter. So he's come up with the idea of distant reading, which in contrast, he says, allows us to look at far bigger research questions, zooming outside the home to look at the world in the round, allegedly. In his methodological book, Distant Reading, Moretti calls for an unlearning of how to read texts. Close reading, the sine qua non of English literary studies, is rejected for what he calls distant reading, a computerized way of looking at an enormous number of texts, imagining them and examining them for patterns, trends, and innovations. Here, distance, he asserts, is a condition of knowledge. It allows you to focus on units that are much smaller or much larger than the text, devices, themes, tropes, or genres and systems. This methodology is particularly useful for those interested in researching world literature, as both the method of distant reading and the non-canonical objects of study go against the grain of Western national historiography. In the graphs chapter of distant reading, Moretti supposedly speaks up for that everyday rather than exceptional literature, which is more representative of society as a whole. This unsettles the assumption behind the literary canon, the idea of great men, sometimes great women, producing great works. So, Jay, if you could please hop 2 slides forward, we've got a quote from Moretti. So the next one and the one after that, you see. Yes, that's perfect. So he writes of a canon of 200 novels, for instance, which sounds very large for 19th century Britain and is much larger than the current one, but is still less than 1% of the novels that were actually published. 20,000, 30 more, no one really knows. And close reading won't help here. A novel a day, every day of the year, would take a century or so. And it's not even a matter of time, but of method. A field this large cannot be understood by stitching together separate bits of knowledge about individual cases, because it isn't a sum of individual cases, it's a collective system that should be grasped as such, as a whole, and the graphs that follow are one way to begin doing this. Here, Moretti presents great works of literature merely as tiny nodes within a vast network, tiny dots of light within the limitless constellation of books being produced. As with stargazing, his worldly approach has the effect of making one feel small and homely. Moretti's kind of methodology is highly computerized and is supposed to make connections between literary studies, the politics of publishing, and pertinent social issues. It offers a broad, a distant and a distancing picture of authorship and literary production, which is of interest not only to researchers in literary studies, but those working in sociology, politics, and publishing. James English and Ted Underwood argue that literary analysis has always meant operating in a specially constructed and privileged space. The Distant Learning Project aimed to rethink this privileged space of the canon and the study of literature by adopting a qualitative methodology of content analysis, often used in the social sciences, and approaching the field of literature from a macro rather than a micro perspective. So Moretti is preoccupied by literature's longue durée, like his intellectual forebear, the historian Fernand Braudel. And through his quasi-scientific graphs, he tries to show the cyclical nature of genre development, gender domination, and so forth. However, I want to challenge Moretti's aim to create a more rational literary history. That is the idea, he declares grandly, but I would suggest it is a Eurocentric and a masculinist idea, notwithstanding Moretti's claim to world literary critical credentials. For example, Mahatma Gandhi warned against the limits of reason when it is untempered with faith or spirituality, arguing that rationalists are admirable beings. Rationalism is a hideous monster when it claims for itself omniscience. I plead not for the suppression of reason, Gandhi says, but for a due recognition of that in us which sanctifies reason, close quote. This thought was not unique to Gandhi. Indeed, many Western schools of thought too, including most obviously the Romantics, but even some philosophers of the Enlightenment, such as Rousseau and Joseph Priestley, had also called for the unity of reason with spirituality. But the Hindu ideas that Gandhi brought to bear in his critique of Western reason, the doctrines of ahimsa, brahmacharya, and vegetarianism, for example, challenged Enlightenment reason by illustrating that the supposed truth of Western reason is perceived differently from a non-Western standpoint. Not only that, but Maurizio Ascari, while espousing the direct benefits of distant reading as a methodology, notes several problems that occur when applying the methodology. He states, "What worries me is Moretti's tendency to regard distant reading as objective, within the framework of a purportedly scientific approach to the humanities." Moretti's protestations notwithstanding, like close reading, distant reading is still a subjective process, as the researcher chooses what to focus on and how to interpret the data that they produce. In the graphs chapter, Moretti writes, "We must do better." True. Despite the scientific spirit extolled by Moretti, he has recently had an academic Me Too case. There are 3 allegations of sexual assault against him, though no charges have been brought. One is from the late 80s, where a graduate student felt uncomfortable with Moretti's pushy sexual behaviour. In the 90s, another student who held a party had to release her dog on Moretti to stop him pestering her. And finally, in the 2000s, Moretti lost a job opportunity at Johns Hopkins for inappropriately touching a student at that university. Just as Moretti makes literary texts seem like minute specks within a galaxy of distant reading, clearly, in his academic Me Too case, he was adept at making women feel small within some of the US's most revered halls of learning. In an online essay about all this, Lauren Klein does a terrific job of unpicking the chauvinist underpinnings of distant reading. She reads Moretti's monstrous behaviour through the lens of Sarah Ahmed's analysis of sexual harassment in universities. Next slide, please. Thank you.
Yeah, this is it.
Lovely. From this discussion of world literature, I now move to an exploration of one particular world literary study in detail, Debjani Ganguly's This Thing Called the World, the contemporary novel as global form, 2016. I read this book myself in 2016 in November, soon after Donald Trump was elected US president, 27 years to the day since the fall of the Berlin Wall. One of This Thing's Called the World most valuable contributions is the attention it accords to the historically significant threshold of 1989 in shaping our current divided political climate. Notwithstanding recent scholarly emphasis on the World Trade Center attacks of 2001 and their aftermath, I agree with Debjani Ganguly's thesis that 1989, a year significant for but not reducible to the collapse of communism, marked the most profound shift in geopolitics and literary aesthetics since the revolutionary movements of '68. Ganguly, who is director of the University of Virginia's Institute of the Humanities and Global Cultures, argues that post-Cold War world novels are notable for their engagement with modern kinds of unending war and insurgency, the digital environment, and human rights discourse. Her disentangling of the terms post-colonial, global, and world in the introduction is much needed and persuasive. Ganguly is immersed in long-standing debates about world literature, from Goethe to Edward Said and Wallerstein. Drawing on romantic sources, she gives us the lovely, instructive phrase, the melancholic realism of the world novel, end quote. She also reflects the increasingly pervasive sense in academia that there are problems with the term post-coloniality, particularly in the light of transnational brands of war and terror without end. Ganguly presents a grisly picture of what she terms, with a nod to Akili Mbembe, death worlds around the globe, as well as resistance movements that deflagrate in response. A chapter late in the book, titled Forensic Witnessing, for example, is an elegy for the Sri Lanka lost in the doomed island's protracted civil war, as portrayed in Michael Ondaatje's Anil's Ghost. This scholar makes an urgent intervention into the emerging field of global digital humanities. She pertinently observes that Tim Berners-Lee made early steps towards creating the World Wide Web in that seminal year of 1989. The ramifications of technological developments for global communications and access to information are compared to the earlier impact of industrial revolutions. And we might pause to think about how, if this pandemic had just happened, even 5 or 10 years earlier, I don't think we would have been able to do everything that we are doing, like this Zoom and Skype, and the way we're all so connected now. It really is, it's been very rapid change. Not necessarily, obviously, all good. I'm not a techno-optimist, but really it has been very significant. So I think to compare it to the Industrial Revolution is quite interesting. Also worthy of praise are Ganguly's fine-grained, close readings of representations of human rights in Anglophone world novels. Like Yeats in Easter 1916, Ganguly takes it as her part to murmur name upon name of characters affected by human rights abuses in these texts. She is adept at naming the unnameable of suffering and bearing witness to the abuser's fiendish acts. Please, could you go to the next slide, because I've got a quote. So for me, oh, sorry, I've probably forgotten to put that quote on. If you could go back, sorry, I'll just read this quote. I'll explain it. So I don't need to read it out, but a central problem with this thing called the world is the lacuna, the missing piece of gender. In the introduction, Ganguly writes about 15 authors that she sees as really significant. They include Ian McEwan, Andrew Miller, Tom Keneally, Salman Rushdie, David Mitchell, Michael Ondaatje, Gil Kortemanch, Richard Flanagan, John Updike, Janet Turner Hospital, Don DeLillo, Mohsin Hamid, Nadim Aslam, and Kevin Powers. But of the 15 authors she lists, only one, Janet Turner Hospital, is female. That's a very poor percentage. Although the chapter situating Hospital's Orpheus Lost as a tragic ode to the fear-saturated worlds of ordinary people post 9/11 is an excellent chapter, the almost entire erasure of women's writing and the issue of gender suggests that the global novel is something of a boys' club. Nadim Aslam, a Pakistani, not an Afghani novelist, as Ganguly asserts, is taken as an authority on successive invasions of Afghanistan, rather than his female compatriot Kamala Shamsi. The graphic novels she looks at in depth are by Joe Sacco and Art Spiegelman, while Marianne Satrapi's Persepolis does not even warrant a mention. In sum, this book's most important contribution to world literature is its exploration of 1989 as a watershed moment in terms of how literature responds to war, technology, and human rights. As the President Trump reiterates his determination to build a wall between the US and Mexico, Ganguly exhorts readers to reject barriers such as walls and barricades. In this monograph, she imagines an inclusive, connected, but I would suggest masculinist world of literature. Next slide, please. So does the home and the world gender divide persist? The almost entire erasure of women's writing and the issue of gender in Ganguly's and comparable monographs suggests, as I have shown, that the world novel is something of a boys' club. Yet contemporary women writers, including Indian diasporic authors such as Kiran Desai, Manju Kapoor and Jhumpa Lahiri, have been instrumental in broadening our knowledge of cultural interconnection at various moments in history, reminding us that national borders are a relatively recent construct and producing experimental, decentered writing influenced by technological advances. In this section of the paper, I will seek to answer the question as to what extent the traditional home and the world gender divide still persists in Indian diasporic literature. In Tagore's 1916 novel, The Home and the World, the soon-to-be Nobel laureate had his female protagonist Bimala say, and this is the next slide. So, oh, maybe the next one? Sorry, yes, here we go. I have read in books that we are all birds in a cage. I could not speak for others, but my cage was so full that I wouldn't find such fullness out there amidst the world. At least that is how I felt at the time. So here is that, very well-worn metaphor of women as birds in cages. But in a way, the bird comes to love her cage. The home is fuller than the world. And this reminds me of Avtar Bra's discussion in Cartographies of Diaspora, where she writes about a homing desire, a homing instinct, a bit like pigeons, kabutar, that want to go home, and they have this instinct to go home. Can you tell I'm learning Hindi and Duolingo during the lockdown? Though it's very basic, and it's probably not relevant to the South. So, think about The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. This smallness, that you can still be godlike in a small sphere. Now, male writers such as Salman Rushdie, Sanjeev Sahota, Jeet Thayil, Hari Kunzru, and Aravind Adiga are, I submit, producing novels that conform to Ganguly's identification of an interest in conflict, terror, migration, new technologies, and human rights abuses. So we might think of Rushdie's Shalimar the Clown, with its trail of Kashmir and terror. That really fits with Ganguly's thesis. Or for migration, we could reach for Sanjeev Sahota's The Year of the Runaways, which has a very interesting portrayal of different migrants, different backgrounds, lower caste, Sikh, Hindu, in Sheffield in northern England, in very precarious circumstances. As for the new technologies and digital humanities, in the 21st century, a great number of mostly male writers are scrutinising what information, communications and entertainment technologies are doing to societies, especially but not exclusively in formerly colonised nations. These technologies include, but are not limited to, phones and drones, social media, music streaming services, blogs, virtual reality, and YouTube. Technology and its impact on or merger with the human is something the men writers in particular are fascinated by. These authors' central focus is understandably often on how fiction might respond. And their primary concern is with the novel and how the novel's form and content is adapting to reflect the plethora of new technologies emerging in the 21st century. I am not then thinking of the insta-poetry of such authors as Rupi Kaur, which is often belittled as a pretty but depthless, homely affair. Nor do I mean to return to the digital humanities, computer-aided distant reading approach of Rupika Rissam or Franco Moretti. Instead, male authors are asking how the 21st century novel, including the dystopian, young adult and graphic novel genres, have been changed by and are changing ICT. Together they explore how gender, race and class relations are being reshaped by the digital world. Several of these fictional works, which include Hari Kunzro's Transmission and Prayab Akhtar's Layla, provides a window onto a technologically assisted future surveyed by drones and subverted by phones. Their post-colonial protagonists may seem powerless, but they sometimes make use of technology in unexpected ways, which appear to protect them, or at least to hold in bay hostile, larger forces. Colonialism and its residues create a gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The novelists emphasize that a lack of material goods and basic amenities is the lot of global outsiders. This contrasts with the affluence of many in the West. However, when even the powerless have powerful technologies in their hands, things may start to change. In Vikram Chandra's non-fiction work, Geek Sublime, which is subtitled The Beauty of Code, the Code of Beauty, he writes as follows, and this is in the next quote, please. So Vikram Chandra himself has worked in software design. So he writes, the fictions about history that form the frontier myth, the stories that the gunfighter nation tells itself, typically present women as dauntless housewives or prostitutes with the requisite hearts of gold. In either case, they are the backdrop. They inhabit the fragile outposts of civilization, the parlour, the schoolhouse, the saloon, on whose behalf the silent hero enacts his all-important rituals of violence out on the mesa. Men do the thinking and planning, women provide, as it were, the clerical support. The mythology of computing similarly celebrates the victory of the male protagonists and erases women from the record. Could I have the next slide, please? So while we think about, does the home and the world gender divide persist, women, by contrast, are tending to represent themselves through more homely novels in Baba's dual sense of the term. This is exemplified not least in the turn towards writing about fast fashion and homeworking in such South Asian texts as Bajwa's The Sari Shop, Bangladeshi British writer Monica Ali's Brick Lane, and Manju Kapoor's Home. In the latter text, Kapoor writes of Nisha, whose engagement to Suresh has broken off. And this is the next quote, please. Thank you. Suppose she were to tell her parents she didn't want to get married. There were such people in the world, but where? Nobody in her social circle, simply nobody, had not married. They were without children, perhaps, widowed, perhaps, but not married. Her memory could only dredge up a few teachers in her college, objects of pity, sympathy, and secret speculation. Now, a prisoner in her home, she played the part of the king in chess. She needed to be protected, as without her, there was no game. The moves concerning her were carefully planned, but she herself was powerless, quiescent, mute, and waiting. So what an interesting quote. The prisoner in the home part recalls Bimala, the bird in the cage, but she gender crosses to become the king, because of course the queen is the powerful one in chess. The king can barely move and has to be protected, as she says. Also evinced in women's writing is a preoccupation with the relationship between the master or mistress and servants within the home, a preoccupation which, as Mariam Mirza explicates in her wonderful monograph, Intimate Class Acts, has something larger to say about social class and caste in South Asia. Now, another subject is food. For example, Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake primarily follows the life of Gogol Ganguly, a second-generation Bengali immigrant like Lahiri herself. Despite the novel being centred on Gogol, it is no less about his mother, Ashima Ganguly, whose experience of the diaspora is my central focus. The novel opens with a pregnant Ashima trying to satisfy her craving for jalmuri, a Bengali street food that she misses in her new home in America. This event is narrated in minute detail, which reveals the author's sensitivity towards and sympathetic understanding of the seemingly trivial aspects of diasporic home life. And this is the next quote, please. Maybe the next one? No, sorry, I've missed this quote. I'll just read it to you. Ashima Ganguly stands in the kitchen of a Central Square apartment, combining Rice Krispies and Planters peanuts and a chopped red onion in a bowl. She adds salt, lemon juice, thin slices of green chili pepper, wishing there were mustard oil to pour into the mix. Ashima has been consuming this concoction throughout her pregnancy, a humble approximation of the snack sold for pennies on Calcutta sidewalks. Tasting from a cupped palm, she frowns. As usual, there's something missing. End quote. Now, the mention of the character's present location, the detailed description of the recipe, including each and every ingredient, and the references to taste and the tactile senses, all this conjures up an image of the yearning for home through food, and Oshima's attempt to recreate her home in the United States. The beginning of the novel sets the tone for the entire journey about to be made by the diasporic subject. Interestingly, the unavailability of the home ingredient induces Oshima to make it in an American way, with some compromise and the innovation of introducing typical US brands, such as Rice Krispies and Planter peanuts, into the mix. This concoction metaphorically denotes the sense of recreating something with both old and new elements that is very common for migrants to do. Additionally, the issue of pregnancy and imminent motherhood add complexity to the episode, making it a gendered and archetypically female experience. Food continues to appear in the novel on numerous occasions. Keeping in mind the connection of food and the kitchen with conventional gender roles and motherhood, I want to emphasise their decentrality for diasporic subjects. Food and eating has received much attention in recent years from critics and scholars with various disciplinary affiliations. As such, food is considered not only part of basic human somatic activities, but also a crucial determinant of subjectivity and identity. More importantly, Ira Raja and John Thiem argue that food always comes with social inscription. According to them, in the case of South Asia, food becomes particularly significant in generating a discourse. Naturally, such a powerful signifier as food occupies an important position in diasporic narratives. Christine Vogt-William perceives the culinary field as a space of cultural negotiation and a connecting bridge to homeland. Anita Manur, in a similar vein, states, among the most complex and common emotion food engenders for a diasporic subject is a sense of nostalgia. For Ketu Katrak, food often functions as an imaginary return to the homeland. Katrak, along with other critics mentioned here, stresses the particular action of remembering home through food. However, this act of remembering is not the only aspect of food in the context of diaspora. Discussing food in the context of Asian diaspora in the United States, Manur comments, food becomes a language through which to imagine Asian alterity in the American imagination, and adds that it feeds into literary rendering of Asian American subjectivity, end quote. What Manur argues is that food functions as a medium through which a diasporic writerly subjectivity comes into being. Along with subjectivity, she further uses the term culinary citizenship to mean the ability to articulate national identity via food. She therefore doesn't only perceive it as a reflective gesture of nostalgia, but also as an assertion of one's national identity in a diasporic location. So could you find the conclusion slide? It might be the next one, or it might be previously. Sorry. Yes, thank you. I conclude by asking, what complicates the world and the home gender divide? The world is a web and net, as is each human being nested within the world, holding other worlds within. Now, the issue of human rights abuses, which we see in novels like Anuradha Roy's Sleeping on Jupiter, the issue of human rights that Muslim, things like Catherine Blue's Behind the Beautiful Forevers, and engagement with modern kinds of unending war and insurgency, exemplified through the rise of the Naxalite novel, Shalama the Clown for Kashmir, northeastern novels of India, and so forth, are all having a real moment in the last decade. Two particular authors and their novels complicate the home novel as female and world novel as male binary, giving grounds for optimism about a less gender-bound future for the new Indian novel. In The Lives of Others, Neil Mukherjee uses his portrayal of a sprawling Indian family home as the setting for his discussion of Naxalite rebellion, economic transformation, and human rights violation. Without providing spoilers, I want to allude to the devastating opening and concluding pages of The Lives of Others. This novel deals with poverty, debt, bonded labour, and the plight of India's tribal peoples, specifically the Santals. It is reminiscent of Mahasweta Devi's short stories, She's Thanked in an Acknowledgement, and to a lesser extent, Arundhati Roy's essays. Neil Mukherjee breathes light into discussions of class, which have perhaps not been so prominent in the post-colonial writing of the 90s and early noughties. There is a renewed interest in class now. It's also omnipresent in Bangladeshi Zia Haider Rahman's In the Light of What We Know. Caste is also a preoccupation, as is the theme of The Lives of Others. So Mukherjee puts emphasis on the impossibility of emphasising with the other, even one's own children, of whether to be good to humanity or one's family. And he does all this through the device of the family home. Gender and sexuality are central issues of The Lives of Others, just as they were in Mukherjee's early novel, A Life Apart. So he's interested in love, courtship, sex, marriage, arranged or not, and spinsterdom. The novel is mostly set in the Ghosh family's claustrophobic, incestuous, four-floored house, a bit like Egyptian novelist Ala al-Aswani's The Yacubian Building. This contains extended and nuclear families and their servants. It's about a top-down hierarchy, an upstairs-downstairs approach. The novel loops back to the early 20th century, taking in much of Bengali history, including partition, Swadeshi, famine, the Second World War, Satyagraha, and culture, the names, the family names of people, the food, Tagore, the Brahmo Samaj. The list could go on. Mukherjee wanted this novel to be compendious and global, despite being set in the deceptively modest setting of the family home. So he brings in economics, Marxist theory through the family relations, and sexual oppression in the case of Sigmund Freud. And the allegory of the nation, as is common in Indian writing in English, the house in many ways acts as a microcosm of Bengal, even India, and the family is, again, figured as the nation. Then to take a contrast, a woman writing a world novel, early in Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of Loss is the image of the wonders of the globe entering the home. Could you go back 2 slides previously, please? One more previously.
This one?
This is it, perfect, thank you. Once a coupon had arrived in the Cho-Oyo post for a free National Geographical inflatable globe, Sai had filled it out and mailed it all the way to a PO box in Omaha. And when so much time had passed that they'd forgotten about it, it arrived, along with a certificate congratulating them for being adventure-loving members pushing the frontiers of human knowledge and daring for almost for a full century. Si and the cook had inflated the globe, attached it to the axis with the provided screws. Rarely was there ever anything unexpected in the mail, and never anything beautiful. They looked at the deserts, the mountains, the fresh spring colours of green and yellow, the snow at the poles. Somewhere on this glorious orb was Bijou. The men, young Bijou and Si's older father, Jemrubai, maybe England or America returned, but they see nothing out there in the world. The novel ends on Bijou's return to what is referred to as the sweet drabness of home in Kalimpong, northeast India. But just as the boy Bijou is settling in, the female protagonist Sai is feeling restless following the breakup of her love affair with tutor Gayan. She thinks of the globe twirling on its axis, of the National Geographic magazines that used to give her a window on the world, as did literature. And she thinks of the men who travelled abroad before her. Quote, and she felt a glimmer of strength, of resolve. She must leave. End quote. Sai knows that home can be unsafe and pollution can exist at home and purity outside. Desai's novel combines everything, the world's subjects of migration and ending war, as well as the home subjects of servants, food, and, quote, authenticity. So to finish, in Midnight's Children, Salman Rushdie has the last quote, which would be, I think, the next slide, the short Rushdie quote.
Yeah, let me see.
Thank you. Brilliant. He writes of a painter whose paintings had grown larger and larger as he tried to get the whole of life into his art. Look at me, he said, before he killed himself. I wanted to be a miniaturist and I've got elephantiasis instead. Nearly 40 years after the publication of Rushdie's landmark novel, it is common for male writers, among whom Rushdie is not exempt, to develop elephantiasis, while female authors are often miniaturists whose intricacies and attention to domestic spaces find them excluded from the world literary canon. But in this lecture, I hope I've been making a case for the miniature, for small-scale reflections that say something much bigger, for the God of small things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claire. Yeah, now we are highly thankful to you for giving us such an informative and excellent talk. Now the session is open for discussion. Claire, shall I stop sharing so that I can see the chat box?
That would be great. Thank you.
Yes. Now the house is open for question and answer session. If anybody has any questions, up to now, only compliments.
There's maybe one or two questions on the chat I could see.
Yeah.
So, yes, somebody asked, do you think that the pandemic, this was Dinesh Nair, do you think that the pandemic and the feverish stillness of lockdown experience will redefine the home world paradigm? Absolutely. So I mentioned this in my lecture, but I'm delighted to have the opportunity to say a little bit more. I mean, it's really difficult to say. I think I have a lot of pessimism, actually, although I said something about the blurring of home and world, and that can be a positive thing. If men are home more and there should be more of a redistribution of these domestic tasks, that would be great. But of course, what we're also hearing about is a rise of domestic violence and some really women living in great situations of fear and great precarity. And we know already from feminist theorists like Sahra Ahmed that the home is not automatically a space of safety. So being locked down at home can be very dangerous for women, despite these ideas that the home is a sanctuary. And also, I think that this pandemic could put gender gains back by a decade or two. You know, women have been, you know, there have been a lot of gains in the 21st century. And I mentioned the Me Too movement, but it feels like women are bearing the brunt of extra labour and their careers are falling behind. I edit a journal and we're seeing a lot more submissions from men academics during this crisis because they are finding they have maybe more time and that the crisis could be an opportunity. Women, and I include myself in this because I've got 2 teenagers and my husband's a doctor, so he's out to work. And women, I mean, it's no fault of his, but women are often left doing the homeschooling, doing the cooking, and have extra work. So it's a mixed bag. I think if we can learn from what we've learned about the world being more connected is a really positive thing. You know, women can't always travel so easily for international conferences. So to do this on Zoom is a great pleasure because it can be done in a half day, whereas traveling to India would probably take most of a week to do it properly without too much jet lag. So it's a great delight to be able to join people in our conversations. I hope this Zoom will continue. But I think we have to look out for female colleagues and make sure that people don't fall behind in their careers because of the extra duties.
Sir, more compliment.
Yeah. So now I hand over the session to Vellalar College.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much, Clara, ma'am, for your lucid presentation. It's a very interesting topic, the world and the home, gender reading. Of course, the gender divide persists. This case study and many references from various texts are very helpful and informative. Thank you, Lord, ma'am. Now the session comes to concluding part. First of all, let me thank Dr. Jason for everlasting support. I would like to express my appreciation and sincere thanks to our respected guest, Professor Clara ma'am, for sparing her time and thoughts and making the session a significant and stimulating one. Thank you, ma'am. My heartfelt thanks to dear participants who follow and encourage us to continue. With these few words, I thank you all once again. Let us join together tomorrow at 8:45 a.m.
Yeah, so Claire, so thank you. So nice to see you in the virtual world. And I think you also got a chance to see Hyderabad and Tamil Nadu at the same time, simultaneously. 2 states of India. So thank you. And so, shall we conclude the session now?
Should I leave?
Yes. So
Thank
we're
you.
highly thankful to you.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Shall we go? Shall I end the meeting?
Yes, we can end the meeting, sir. Tomorrow at 8:30, can we join or?
Yeah, and there is one, plenary from 5 to 7. If somebody wants to join that, they can join with the same ID.
Okay.
Yeah. So now I end the meeting.
Yes, sir.
So
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for making each and every session successful and vibrant with your questions. So thanks to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.